Okay, good morning, everybody. It's just about that time. First, I'd like to wish everybody a very happy new year. And I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Prestige webinar series and the very first webinar of 2021. I hope everybody on the call today had a very happy and healthy holiday and hopefully some much-deserved time off and relaxation. I know that we're all thrilled to be able to put 2020 in the rearview mirror, but truth be told, there is still some work to do here in the new year. Quite a bit has transpired since our last webinar, so naturally there is a lot to discuss. So, as many of you know, my name is Jason Flynn. My picture on the screen is much bigger than what you're probably accustomed to, but I would like to thank our marketing department for the sleek look on our new slides. I know they put a lot of work into it, and it looks great. So they are a great partner for me in these webinars, as always. But as I was getting into, my name is Jason Flynn, and I am the Director of Human Resources and Client Services for Prestige PEO. Joining us this morning is the founder and CEO of Prestige PEO, and that would be Andrew Lubach. Of course, we also welcome back Seth Peretta and Malcolm Slee, both of who are partners from the Groom Law Group. Those are all three definitely familiar faces that have helped us throughout this webinar series, and the Groom Law Group has definitely been one of our trusted partners throughout the year and, of course, in participation of these webinar series. So it's great to have all of them, Andy, Seth, and Malcolm, participating in the webinar this morning, and I'm certainly looking forward to everything that they're going to bring and speak about during the webinar. So let's get into today's agenda. Andrew will be kicking things off first with a few words and to make an introduction to Seth and Malcolm. And I'm looking forward to what Andy has to bring to the call, as I always do on these webinars. From that point forward, Seth and Malcolm are really going to be running the show today. The new COVID-19 relief package, known as the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, they just continue to roll off the tongue, these names of these acts. So this was signed into law on December 27th, and this includes a $900 billion relief and stimulus package. Seth and Malcolm are going to provide a breakdown of this bill and the impact it's going to have on small to medium-sized businesses. Some of the topics that they will cover today will be around unemployment and relief payments, health-related relief, and of course, the paid leave provisions that we've spoken about, throughout 2020. Then Seth and Malcolm will discuss the expansion of the Paycheck Protection Program, the extension of the employee tax retention or the employee retention tax credit, as well as the payroll tax deferral. So just as a quick reminder before I hand things off, all the participants today on the webinar will be muted throughout the call. However, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A feature within the webinar so that those questions can be directed towards the panelists. And of course, we're going to do everything we can to answer all the questions that we see coming in. Following the webinar, a recording as well as a copy of the slides you see here today will be available on the Prestige PEO website. This can be found under the Prestige Perspective and COVID-19 sections of the Prestige PEO website. So from this point now, I'd like to hand the reins over to Andrew Lubach, who would like to say a few words. Andy, you're on the line.
I got it. I'm here. Okay, and that's definitely not me on the slide. So Seth and Malcolm are so much better looking than me. Anyway, do you hear me?
We can hear you, loud and clear.
Okay. All right. Anyway, again, everyone, as always, first of all, a happy and healthy new year. I mean, all good things in 2021. 2020 was, wow, beyond words. The beginning of 2020 was beyond words, excuse me. 2021 has started off a bit beyond words as well, but again, hopefully things will start to get back on track and we could begin to return to our normal lives. Again, I want to thank everybody for all the assistance and input throughout the year. Again, we completely appreciate it at Prestige. Again, as we'll see starting this year, I mean, more and more than ever, a PEO is going to be something that is going to be your best friend, I think, Prestige. We see some legislation now that we're going to be talking about that was passed at the end of last year, and I expect, based upon the new administration and from some of the notes that I've received, and Seth has actually provided some of them already, we're going to see quite a bit of change in 2021, and we're all going to need to be on top of it. We'll continue to provide webinars and guard our clients, and also assist anyone that may need assistance as well. But again, change is definitely coming. We probably will see a bit more regulation than we've seen in the past, especially on the employer side. That's what we're here for. Again, door is always open, as I always mention, and I've given out my email address, which is alubach@prestigepeo.com, and my direct line, which is 917-258-0223. The door is open, okay? If anyone has any questions, concerns, things you'd just like to talk about, things that we can do better, things that we're already doing well that you don't want us to stop doing, we're here. So, again, in the essence of time, and everyone that knows me knows I can ramble on forever, I want to turn it over to Seth and Malcolm. Many of you have heard their webinars and their presentations through the past year, and feedback has been we have all found them completely informative. They've really given us insight as to, what is taking place on the legislative and political front. So, without further ado, Seth and Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Andy. A pleasure to be here. Happy New Year to all of you. As I think Andy did a very good job of setting up here, we're heading into a period of time of, certainly a change in administration, probably increased enforcement and regulation. It often happens with any change in administration as we see, some of the things previously done sort of being undone, and then you've got your new administration with its own regulatory priorities taking hold. Today's presentation is very much going to be focused on the piece of legislation, we call it CAA 2021, because that's easier than the full title. But we're going to talk about really the COVID 4.0, or the Omnibus stimulus bill that was passed at the end of last year and then signed into law by President Trump early in 2021. So if we move to our next slide, and the way we're going to really do this here is I'm going to sort of moderate us through, and then Malcolm is going to add in all the smart, intelligent comment and thought that I'm lacking. So you can sort of zone out on me and then obviously listen very closely to Malcolm. But here is the CAA of 2021. Had a price tag of $2.3 trillion, which is a hotly contested issue between the House Democrats and the Senate Republicans. It passed on December 21st. As you may recall, and something we'll talk about as we move through today's presentation, is that President Trump had threatened to veto the legislation in large part because the individual relief payments, which were $600, he wanted $2,000. And as you may recall, that became a sticking point. He ultimately did sign the law into effect on December 27th. It is almost 6,000 pages, reportedly the longest piece of legislation ever passed by Congress. Thankfully, Malcolm has read every single page at least 2 or 3 times, or maybe not, but we've read what's relevant for the conversation today, and we're going to give a high-level overview of what's really important for you all. What's in this massive piece of legislation that small and mid-sized employers really need to understand. And we're doing sort of a high-level presentation, and I would expect that your friends at Prestige will, over the course of the next several weeks, sort of unpack each of the provisions in the legislation to a greater level of detail. But this is really intended to give you a high-level overview of what's in the legislation that might be of interest to you. All right, moving on now to the next slide. We're going to first talk about unemployment insurance and the relief payment. So these are things that really aren't really directly relevant to your business, but are obviously hugely important to you as you think about staffing and your workforce. So as you may recall, there was an extension of unemployment insurance through really the end of December of last year, provided an additional $300 per week to the states for unemployment insurance benefits. This had lapsed, I believe, as of December 26th of last year. The CAA actually sort of reinstates that for benefits through March 14th of 2021. So what really happened is whatever was in effect as of December 25th of last year remains in effect through March 14th. All right, moving on now to the next slide. Individual relief payments. These are the stimulus payments. As you may recall, there was a prior stimulus payment that was made of $600 going back to sort of the spring of 2020. And this was a hotly contested issue because the Democrats had wanted $2,000 per individual, but ultimately the Republicans could not get on board, and there was some concern that those payments could actually have an inflationary effect, et cetera. Hotly contested. President Trump wanted $2,000. Ultimately, he signed the bill at the $600. So what this does is it's a $600 payment per individual taxpayer, or $1,200 for taxpayers that are filing jointly or married. And then there's a payment for $600 for each child dependent under the age of 17. So there is subject to a phase out. So if you have a adjusted gross income of $75,000 as an individual taxpayer or $150K for joint filers, the actual relief payment goes to zero. But those tax payments are actually on their way out as we speak. So folks should be receiving them, shortly. All right, moving on now to our next slide. We're going to talk very, very quickly about health-related relief provisions. For most of you, these are going to be things that you experienced as you either sponsor your own client-level health plans or you participate in the Prestige Master Health and Welfare Plan. Much of this is not something that you're going to sort of have to actively engage with. The CAA did include funding for COVID testing and vaccines. Unfortunately, no return to work testing or reinsurance programs, as had been proposed by the Democrats. Those did not make that into the final bill. This is largely around more public health measures. There was a surprise billing fix in this legislation that would basically, when your employees who are covered under a group health plan either go for emergency room services or alternatively go to an in-network facility but receive care from an out-of-network physician, the legislation would effectively protect your employees against being balance billed. It is a complicated surprise billing fix, but really one that will be handled largely by your carrier if you have a fully insured plan. So it will be helpful for your employees in sort of taking them out of the middle of a balance bill situation, but much to come in terms of how the surprise billing fix will actually play out. There are a series of health transparency provisions in here, none of which I think are hugely relevant for you all. The one thing on here I do want to highlight is that the other health bucket at the bottom. So the CAA did include relief for FSA and DCAP. Many folks had made elections in 2020, but ultimately did not utilize those FSA dollars, those DCAP dollars, because they either were not at work, they were not using childcare, they were not in great elective procedures. The bill does include a spate of FSA and DCAP relief, both allowing for carry forward of unused amounts in 2020 to 2021, as well as a series of additional pieces of relief. Now, these are elective provisions. My understanding is that most employers, such as Prestige, will be taking steps to extend this relief. At this point, there are a lot of unanswered questions, and we do know the IRS is anticipating putting out some guidance to employers around how to implement the FSA DCAP relief. So what I would say for the moment is sit tight. I'm sure Prestige will be communicating out with you, but this is something that will largely be something that is rolled out in the next, I would say, next few weeks, next month or so. Last thing is for folks taking an individual deduction on the 1040. Currently, or up until the CAA, you could only claim a deduction for expenses that exceeded 10% of your modified adjusted gross household income. That has now dropped to 7.5% per the CAA. All right, next slide here. This is where I start to rope in my good friend Malcolm. So Malcolm, paid family and emergency sick leave, obviously an important provision because it applied on a mandatory basis really to employers with under 500 employees. That paid family and emergency sick leave had expired. But can you update us as to what the CAA did in terms of paid family and emergency sick leave? And Malcolm, you may be on mute.
I was on mute. Thank you, Seth. And good morning to everyone. Yeah, so folks probably remember this back from the Families First Act, which was really the first relief bill from last year when the COVID-19 crisis hit. This was, really the first time that there was federally mandated paid sick and family medical leave, but it was required on a limited basis, which was really only through the end of 2020. What the new bill does is it doesn't require affected employers, and you'll see there, this leave requirement only applied to employers with under 500 employees. It doesn't extend the requirement to actually provide the paid sick and the paid family medical leave. But if you choose to continue providing the leave, you can qualify for the tax credits that were available under the Family First Act. So if you're an employer that was affected by this last year, the bottom line here is no requirement that you continue to provide the paid sick and paid family medical leave. But if you want to do so, then those tax credits will continue to be available to you through the end of March of this year. So it's kind of a win-win for employers. You're not actually required to provide the leave, but if you want to do so because you think it's good for your employees, you can still qualify for those tax credits. Seth, are you on mute?
I know. Sorry. Now I'm on mute. Oh, my goodness. Thank you very much, Malcolm. Really appreciate it. So the next thing we're going to look at is the employee retention tax credit and the ERTC. If we move to the next slide, this was basically something that was, I think, important for some employers, but didn't necessarily give the bang for the buck that most folks had hoped for. As you may recall, the employee retention tax credit was basically set up to say that for employers who kept employees on the payroll, if you sort of retained your workforce on a per employee basis, you could basically receive a tax credit for certain qualifying wages that were paid. Now, the unfortunate thing about the ERTC was, A, its interaction with the ability to claim other sort of CARES Act provisions, such as the payroll tax deferral or the PPP loans. The other big problem is that the qualifying, and Malcolm, I'm hearing background noise if it's coming from you. The other unfortunate reality about the ERTC was that effectively it was capped at a total credit of $5,000. So it wasn't an overly rich tax credit or benefit. The ERTC has been expanded by the CAA for purposes of Q1 and Q2. A couple things to keep in mind is that the ERTC applies on a quarterly basis. So we had several quarters in 2020, and now we have Q1 and Q2 in 2021 that are going to be really relevant for this conversation. The other thing I want to highlight here is that the ERTC, because it was in effect dating back to sort of the CARES Act, the Family First Act, there are tax credits that were already available that may already have been received. And then there's sort of 2021 wages that are currently sort of being earned and will be paid that could give rise to new tax credits. Just to make your life more complicated, the CAA not only makes prospective changes related to wages earned in 2021 in Q1 and Q2, it also makes some retroactive changes that not only apply to Q1 and Q2 of 2021, but go all the way back to when the ERTC was originally created. And so as we walk through today's presentation on the ERTC, we're first going to tackle those things that not only apply prospectively, but also retroactively. And then we're going to tackle those things that are prospective only. So just keep that in mind as we move through today's presentation. So if we move to the next slide here, the first thing we want to talk about are those retroactive changes. These are changes that go all the way back to when the CARES Act was enacted and then apply not only to 2020 wages, but also to the qualifying, the wages that may qualify as qualified wages in 2021, which are really wages being paid in Q1 and Q2 of 2021. So to that end, Malcolm, can you walk through what are the changes that go not only apply prospectively, but also retroactively?
Sure. So the first one, and this is an important one, under the original law as it was written in the CARES Act, if you were a company and you applied for and received a Paycheck Protection Program loan, a PPP loan, you weren't eligible to claim the employee retention tax credit. And this rule also applied to any affiliated companies if there was common ownership or some sort of other relationship. So if you had a company in your control group that received a PPP loan, basically any other company that had more than 50% common ownership was also not going to be eligible to claim the employee retention tax credit. The new law fixes that. So if you are a company that received a PPP loan, you are no longer prohibited from claiming this employee retention tax credit. The only catch is that if you paid wages with the proceeds of your PPP loan and that PPP loan has been forgiven, you can't also claim the employee retention tax credit with regard to those wages that were paid, which makes sense, right? That would give you a double benefit. It would be double dipping under the tax code. And as Seth mentioned, this change is retroactive to the effective date of the CARES Act, which was back in March of last year. So if you got a PPP loan last year and you paid qualified wages in excess of what you got forgiven under your PPP loan, and you're eligible to claim the credit, you can go back and file an amended employment tax return to claim the credit, or at least you should be able to. One thing we want to note here is because this law is so new, really the agencies have not gotten around to providing a lot of guidance here. So if you go to the IRS website looking for additional information on the 2021 employee retention tax credit, they don't really have anything up there now. But this, in theory, at least, is how it should be able to work. Again, you should be able to go back and file amended employment tax returns to claim the credit if you were eligible for it in 2020. The second, we got some more on this slide. If you can go back, please. Yeah, the second thing here is that group health plan expenses can now be considered qualified wages under the employee retention tax credit, which means you can claim the credit for amounts spent on your group health plan. That's really good news, obviously, and it was unclear under the prior CARES Act rule. And then lastly, Seth, do you want to talk about the special reporting rule for employers? You on mute?
So basically, there might have been employers who have already filed a tax return for the applicable employment taxes that would have given rise to an ERTC before December 27th of 2020. What the special reporting rule is designed to do is effectively allow you to take advantage of the retroactive changes. So it allows you to go back in time and effectively claim the full amount of the tax credit. Now, we don't have any sort of additional guidance yet from the IRS around how this is going to work, but it may be a situation where you don't need to file amended 941s. There'll be a separate process for how you're able to capture the full extent of that tax credit without having to do amended 941. At this point, we don't have any of that detail, so it's hard to know. But there is, Congress did contemplate a world where we want to make it easy for employers to realize any additional ERTC by reason of these retroactive changes if they've already filed their 941s or the PEO has filed a 941 in connection with their client employers. So we will see. Malcolm, maybe what we do now is move on now to the next slide here. And now we're going to start talking about prospective changes. These are things that are applying to Q1 and Q2 of 2021. So the first thing it did is it changed the definition of an eligible employer. It made it easier to qualify as an eligible employer. Malcolm, I'm getting feedback, I think, from your phone. But if Malcolm, you were able to explain sort of how the eligible employer definition changed, that would be fantastic.
Yep, thanks, and sorry about the feedback. So under the CARES Act, the way that you effectively qualified for the rule was that if your operations were fully or partially suspended by a COVID-19 related governmental order, effectively government shut down, your industry because of concerns about COVID-19, or if your gross receipts during a calendar quarter declined by more than 50% when compared to the same quarter if you looked at 2019. So if you looked at any quarter in 2020 and your gross receipts were less than 50% of what they were in that same quarter in 2019, then you are eligible for the credit. Effective as of January 1st, 2021, you will qualify again if your business operations are either fully or partially suspended due to a COVID-19 lockdown order, or for a quarter in 2021, if your gross receipts are less than 80% of gross receipts for the same quarter in 2019. So you're only looking at a potential 20% reduction. So that's great news for businesses, right? The bar has been significantly lowered. I think there are a fair number of businesses that had difficulty hitting that 50% reduction threshold. That's a pretty harsh reduction. So many more additional businesses should be eligible for the credit due to the lowering of that bar. And again, for 2021, you're going to be comparing your gross receipts in either the first quarter or second quarter of 2021 to the first quarter or second quarter of 2019.
Thank you, Malcolm. Very, very helpful. If we move now to the next slide, another prospective change is around the definition of a qualifying wage. What wages do you get to take into account for purposes of claiming the employee retention tax credit? As you'll see on this slide, for the 2020 wages, the rules had two different definitions. One was for employers with less than, or I guess, 100 or fewer full-time employees. All of their wages were able to qualify. For employers with 101 full-time employees or more, then the qualifying wages were limited to wages paid to employees not performing services due to basically COVID-related events. So in number one, all wages qualified. In number two, it was only the wages that were paid when the employees were not providing services. What you'll see here is that under the CAA, for 2021 Q1 and Q2 wages, what it does is it applies that first rule for employers with 100 or fewer full-time employees. It applies that rule to employers with 500 or fewer. So what that means is that for employers with 500 or fewer full-time employees, for looking at what is a qualifying wage in 2021, they're going to look at all wages, not just those wages paid for when the employee is not performing a service. So this is a helpful rule for employers that with 101 to 500 full-time employees. All right, moving on now to the next slide. And I'm going to toss this up to you, Malcolm. But one of the other changes is that there is unfortunately a limit being placed on the amount of the advanced payment that can be received with respect to the ERTC. The ERTC is generally paid as an offset on your payroll tax obligation, but you can receive amounts as an advance payment to the extent you effectively don't have employment taxes that equal or exceed the amount of the available tax credit. But Malcolm, my sense is Congress saw fit to impose a limit?
Well, actually, the good news is that under the new law, it looks like they're taking action to try and remove the limit. So the limit was really under the CARES Act, where you didn't have the ability to effectively monetize this credit before the qualified wages were paid. Now, the law itself doesn't provide really any specific rules or details, but it directs the Treasury Department to draft guidance to allow for employers to claim an advance payment of the credit. The catch here, as noted on the slide, is that the advance payment is only going to be available to companies with 500 or fewer employees, and based on 70% of the average quarterly payroll for the same quarter in 2019. So it's going to be limited in terms of which employers are going to be eligible for the advance payment. But this is all sort of, something to keep your eye on if you think you might qualify. Treasury is supposed to come out with guidance allowing for the advance payment of the credit. There will almost certainly, knowing the IRS, there'll be new forms, new instructions. We don't really have any idea at this point when it's going to happen. And obviously right now it's a time of enormous change in Washington with the new administration coming in. But hopefully sometime in the next month or so, we'll get some guidance from Treasury regarding how these advance payments can be claimed.
Thank you, Malcolm. I appreciate the clarification there. Moving on now to the next slide. There is an anti-abuse provision. I would not be overly concerned about this. Effectively, this is being designed by Congress to sort of authorize IRS to issue guidance intended to prevent folks claiming the ERTC when they really don't deserve it. The statute specifically calls out employee leaseback arrangements. So where you're not really continuing to keep the employee on your payroll, but you're effectively sort of leasing them back from another. So say there's a successor employer who has hired them, they lease them back to you, so it looks like you're actually paying the wages. Long story short, if you're engaging in schemes to create the impression that you have continued to keep an employee on your payroll when in fact the services are really being provided elsewhere, that is something to be careful of, because the IRS and Congress are onto those schemes, and the IRS, we expect, will be coming out with prospective anti-abuse guidance. All right, moving on now to the next slide. I don't think we've quite moved yet, but hopefully we will move momentarily here. Or Malcolm, maybe I'm having trouble with my
No, I think I'm seeing the same slide as well. We may have a little lag here. There we go.
Here we go. So the last rule, and we're not going to go into detail on this, is the no double dip rule. And what this is effectively intended to say is that if you're using the wages for ERTC purposes, you can also use those wages for other things. And you'll see here in the first bullet, they sort of expanded the extent of the double dip prohibition. That second bullet there is what applied for purposes of 2020. We're not going to walk through this, but for folks who have thought that they may be claiming a tax credit for any of those, or using the wages for purposes of any of those reference sections there, you'll need to be thoughtful to avoid the double dip problem. All right, now we are so very close to moving on to some more exciting things here as we move to the next slide. All right, this is a new disaster provision. This is not, this is something that I think folks had wanted to see, but it's actually not really tied to COVID, more sort of to general disasters. But Malcolm, do you want to explain this new disaster provision?
Yep. So, this is a different kind of employee retention tax credit. Not really, as Seth noted, related to the old one. This is kind of a special provision. I'm not sure it's going to be super applicable to folks out there, but we just wanted to highlight it so it was on your radar. There's a new 40% employee retention tax credit that applies for the first quarter and second quarter of 2021 if your business was affected by certain qualifying disasters. Qualifying disasters is defined in the bill as a major disaster declared by effectively the Department of Homeland Security between starting in January 1st, 2020 and ending 60 days after the Appropriations Act was passed. So we're looking, basically around the end of February, beginning of March. Looking back at all the disasters for 2020, and there were so many of them, you can go on the website to Google major disasters to find out what might be affected. You think like the California wildfires. We had some hurricanes last year, which mostly hit the Texas, Louisiana area. The one I found for New York State, where I know a lot of folks are located on this call, was Tropical Storm Isaias. It would not include any disaster related to COVID-19. That in and of itself was declared a disaster, but Congress want to make clear this applies really to other types of, what we think of as natural disasters. And as noted there, this tax credit is generally a business credit that applies to income taxes as opposed to a payroll tax credit. And it applies to the wages paid without regard to whether or not the employee performed services. So again, we just want to get this on your radar. If you happen to be a business that was, shut down due to some sort of natural disaster in 2020 or at the beginning of 2021 for whatever reason, this is something you may want to be looking into.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. All right, moving now to the next slide. We want to move into the payroll tax deferral. This is, as you guys may recall, the CARES Act allowed you to defer the employer's share, not the employee share, but the employer's share of the Social Security tax for basically the period of time from the date of enactment of the CARES Act in March of 2020 through the end of 2020, December 31, 2020. 50% could be deferred and effectively had to be repaid by the end of 2021. The other remaining 50% that was deferred had to be paid by the end of 2022. CAA 2021 made no changes to this provision. So effectively, if you took advantage of the payroll tax deferral in 2020, you're still going to have to pay 50% of that deferred amount. You have to pay that back by the end of 2021. The remaining 50% have to be paid back by December 31st of 2022. You may also recall that towards the end of 2020, President Trump put out a memorandum where he wanted to facilitate employers being able to defer the employee share of the Social Security tax that were on wages paid from September 1st to December 31st of 2020. Under an IRS notice that came out, if those amounts were deferred, they had to be ratably paid over the period from January 1st to April 30th of 2021. We're not aware of many employers who took advantage of that deferral opportunity because employers would have remained on the hook without really having a wage base to then sort of pay them out of. So we aren't aware of many employers who took advantage of that. For those employers who did, the CAA extends that repayment period through the close of 2021. So effectively, instead of having just 4 months to repay the deferred employee share, you have 12 months through the end of 2021. All right, moving on now to the next slide. This is probably what you've all been waiting to hear about. We put it at the end on purpose, so you have to stand and listen to all of our other thoughtful analysis and discussion. You can blame Malcolm, it was totally his idea. I'm joking, it was totally my idea. But I'm now going to turn it over to Malcolm to walk us through the Paycheck Protection Program changes. So Malcolm, you want to walk us through?
Thanks, Seth. So if we can move to the next slide. We have a little lag again here. Here we go. Okay, so this was baked into the Appropriations Act. There's a specific bill called the Economic Aid to Hard-Hit Small Businesses, Nonprofits, and Venues Act. And I'm going to assume most of the folks on the call probably have some familiarity with the PPP. We did a number of webinars on it for Prestige last year. You may recall that the PPP effectively shut its doors last August. It wasn't that it ran out of money. It was just, that was the way the law was written was if you didn't apply for a loan before August, you were out of luck. Most businesses obviously got in pretty quickly last spring to apply for their PPP loan. What the new bill does is it reopens the PPP until the end of March. And you may have seen the SBA reopened the portal on Monday of this week. So the government is open for business. If your lender is open for business, they are now taking PPP loans again. And it makes some changes to the rules that apply to those PPP loans. But really significantly, it now adds new, what people are referring to as second draw PPP loans for eligible borrowers that already received a PPP loan last year and used the entire thing. So during the duration of the presentation, if you hear me referring to PPP1, I'm talking about loans provided under the original program. If you hear me refer to PPP2, I'm referring to those second draw PPP loans that have now been added under this Economic Aid Act. One really, really significant thing, this was a huge issue all through end of last year, and thankfully has been addressed by Congress in the new bill. IRS and Treasury came out with guidance last year where if you got a PPP loan and you then had that PPP loan forgiven or some portion of it forgiven, and the forgiven amounts related to business expenditures like, the payment of wages, things that you ordinarily would be able to claim a tax deduction on. IRS took a really firm position that even if those business expenditures ordinarily would have been deductible, if you paid for them with a PPP loan and that PPP loan was forgiven, then the expenses would no longer be deductible. Again, sort of under this concept that you shouldn't be able to effectively double dip under the tax code and get two tax benefits, since the forgiveness of your PPP loan is effectively sort of a tax-free grant from the government. The Appropriations Act reversed the IRS guidance. So this is really, really great news for 2020. If you had business expenditures that you paid for with a PPP loan and that PPP loan got forgiven, you can still deduct those business expenditures on your tax return going forward. So it is effectively sort of a double benefit for businesses, but probably a well-deserved one given everything that businesses went through over the last year or so. So that's great news. The other thing we wanted to highlight on this slide, SBA and Treasury moving really quickly with regard to the new PPP rules. They've already released 2 interim regulations. They released those last Wednesday, I believe. They have already released revised loan applications and a new loan application for the second draw loans. Those went up on the PPP website, I believe, on Friday night. And there's going to be a lot of additional guidance on this front as well. We're expecting SBA will be releasing new FAQs and additional guidance related to the new provisions we're going to cover. So this area is moving very rapidly, and we'll certainly be working with Prestige to provide follow-up information to you all, but you want to keep your eyes on the SBA website and the Treasury website, because the guidance is going to be coming fast and furious. So if we can do the next slide, please. Okay, so among the great things that is included in the new bill is Congress has given us some new categories of things that we can spend our PPP loan money on. And also, if we spend our PPP loan money on these things, it is potentially forgivable. So these 4 new categories, the first is covered operations expenditures. So now you can spend your PPP money, you can clearly spend it on software and cloud computing expenses, which are related to your human resources functioning, your accounting functioning. The statutory language is very clear that you can spend this money on software and cloud computing expenses. It's a little less clear regarding whether or not you can spend this money on, human resources expenses generally. And we're hoping to get some additional guidance from SBA on this front. But to the extent you're spending the money on software and cloud computing expenses, you should be totally fine spending PPP money on that. Covered property damage costs. If your business happened to be in an area where, it was affected by the public disturbances that occurred during 2020, which were well covered in the news, and you had property damage and it wasn't covered by insurance, you can now use PPP proceeds to pay for the cost related to that property damage. Covered supplier costs. So if you happen to have a contract or a purchase order that you took out prior to taking your loan, and the expenditures under that contract or purchase order were essential to your operations, then you can use your PPP money to pay your supplier. So, you think about if your business really, entered into a contract that was essential to keep your business running, effectively payments to that vendor or supplier, you can use PPP money to pay them. And then lastly, covered worker protection expenditures. So you can use PPP money now to pay for PPE, another acronym, things that effectively will allow your business to operate as we struggle through the COVID-19 pandemic, hopefully, only for a few more months. But, for example, if you wanted to add like a drive-through facility to your restaurant so that people could come, drive and pick up food without having to go into the building, or you want to put up plexiglass shields to keep, you've got a retail establishment, you want to keep shoppers away from your employees and vice versa. You want to spend your money on masks, other things that will, keep your employees safe. As you see here, it's really protective equipment or other investments that will help the borrower comply with governmental guidelines related to COVID-19 starting on March 1st of 2020. The other thing I want to note about these new great categories of expenses you can spend your PPP loan, all of these are retroactive. So, if you got a PPP loan in 2020 and you're still paying it down, or you're still using the proceeds for whatever reason, and you're having difficulty trying to figure out what to spend your money on, you can spend it on any of these things and you're totally fine. Or, alternatively, if you did spend the money, you got a PPP loan in 2020 and you've spent the money, but you haven't applied for forgiveness yet, you can, on your forgiveness application, note that you spent money on these things. And that's not going to cause a problem for you. Although, as folks will recall, if you want to get full forgiveness under the PPP, you need to be spending at least 60% of your loan proceeds on payroll costs. None of these are considered payroll costs, but it's obviously better than if you didn't spend the money at all. If we can move on to the next slide. So there's some other notable changes to PPP. I talked just a little bit just now about the concept of payroll costs and how this is really what you want to be spending your PPP money on. And we've talked about this on past webinars as well. As much as possible, you want to spend your PPP money on payroll costs because that increases your ability to get the bulk of the loan forgiven. Additional good news from Congress is that they've slightly expanded the definition of payroll costs to include the costs of certain ancillary benefits like group life, disability, vision, or dental insurance. Major medical, health insurance was already included in that definition of payroll costs. So they've added some additional categories there. Again, all good news because that just, again, gives you, more things that you can categorize potentially as payroll costs. There is now additional flexibility for the borrower to pick the duration of the covered period. The covered period is important under the PPP because, again, when you're applying for forgiveness of your PPP loan, the covered period is critical because that's the period you look at for purposes of determining how you were spending your loan proceeds. So it's really how you spent your loan proceeds during the covered period, which will determine how much of the loan proceeds are going to be forgivable. Employers were really looking for some flexibility in terms of how they define their covered period. And now Congress has said you can pick any period between 8 and 24 weeks after the origination date of the loan. So that is good news as well. We already talked about the ability to deduct expenses even if they're paid for with PPP proceeds. So that's good news as well. The loan forgiveness application, again, those of you who suffered through our webinars from last year understand how complicated the PPP loan forgiveness application can be. Really good news if you took out a small loan of $150,000 or less. Congress has said going forward, there is just going to be a simplified one-page loan forgiveness application for those small loans where you essentially are just going to sort of have to check a box saying that you spent the money on the things that you were supposed to spend it on. So that's really, really good news. If you were a borrower that returned part of your PPP loan because you weren't sure if you were going to be able to use it all, or you didn't borrow the full amount for which you were eligible because you were being conservative, and now you regret that decision and you realize you really could have used the additional PPP money for which you were eligible, the law provides that you can request a modification from your lender to increase the loan amount to the maximum, and presumably most lenders are going to be more than happy to go along with that. So that is really good news as well. Affiliation rules. This gets super, super complicated, but keep in mind that Congress wanted to make PPP loans available to businesses that are a little larger than the businesses that the SBA usually services. So they made PPP loans generally available to employers with 500 or less employees. But the complicating factor there is that SBA applies affiliation rules. So essentially, in terms of determining whether you're over that 500 employee threshold, they're going to look at all the businesses that have common ownership that might be in your controlled group. It can be very complicated in terms of determining who is in your affiliated group. If you happen to be a business that is a news organization, you publish a small newspaper, I don't know if there's any, news broadcast stations out there, maybe not. But if you're a news organization, the good news is they've made those affiliation rules much easier for you to satisfy. Effectively, they're not going to look at the other companies that you're related to. So if you happen to be a news organization, that's something you're definitely going to want to look into. And then lastly, there is a general rule now that if you are a publicly traded company, you are now ineligible for PPP. Most of these rules liberalize the PPP rule. This is one that makes the rules a little more restrictive. So if there are any publicly traded companies out there, unfortunately, you are out of luck when it comes to your PPP eligibility. Moving on. Okay, second draw loans. So again, great news for businesses. You've got the ability now. Let's talk about the second part of the slide first. Who's eligible for these second draw loans? I don't want to get everyone's hopes up. Hopefully you meet these eligibility requirements. First of all, you can't have more than 300 employees. I mentioned the 500 employee threshold for getting a PPP-1 loan. If you want a PPP-2 loan, you can't have more than 300 employees. Second eligibility requirement, you have to have either used or will use the full amount of your PPP-1 loan on the things that eligible expenses, the things that you should have been using that loan on. So you really have to have already maxed out your usage of the PPP-1 loan to get a second draw loan. And then lastly, you need to generally demonstrate that you had a 25% reduction in gross receipts in a calendar quarter during 2020 relative to the same quarter in 2019. Or alternatively, what SBA has now said in their guidance is that, effectively, if you can show a 25% reduction for all of 2020 relative to all of 2019, you can also qualify, which makes sense because obviously you would have had to have pass the test for at least 1 quarter if you can prove it for the entire year. If you meet these eligibility requirements, going up to the top of the slide, you know, I can hear you all licking your chops. That's the maximum amount you can get for your second draw loan. It's very similar to what you could get under a PPP-1 loan. It's based on 2.5 times your average monthly payroll costs in the year prior to the loan, or looking at either the payroll costs for 2019 or 2020, up to a maximum amount of $2 million. So there's a little bit of the cap for the second draw loans of $2 million is a little lower than what it was for the first draw loans, but still a really, really great opportunity for employers that are eligible. Moving on. Yeah, so a little more additional information here about the second draw loans. Really, the rules for the PPP-2 loans or the second draw loans are very similar to the rules for the PPP-1 loans. The great news is you can get the second draw loan forgiven in the same way that you can get a PPP-1 loan forgiven. Those forgiveness rules are almost identical. You can, you know, get loan forgiveness as long as you spend your second draw loan on all those things listed there: payroll costs, mortgage, rent, utilities for your business. And then those 4 new categories that I touched on a few slides ago, those all apply to the PPP-2 loans as well. But keep in mind, again, that rule that is critical, which is you have to have spent at least 60% of your loan proceeds on payroll costs as opposed to non-payroll costs in order to qualify for full loan forgiveness. So again, that's exactly the same rule as it applies to PPP-1, applies to PPP-2 as well, but hopefully most businesses out there won't have much difficulty hitting that threshold. And with that, I think we are wrapped up.
Malcolm, thank you. I wanted to just clarify one point. I'm not sure. In looking at the slides, it looks like one of our slides did not make it into the final presentation. This just goes back to the employee retention tax credit. What we wanted to make clear about on the ERTC is that for Q1 and Q2, the tax credit is equal to 70% of the qualifying wages paid rather than 50%. And the qualifying wages, rather than being $10,000 for the entire year, are $10,000 per quarter. So the maximum ERTC credit that one could receive in Q1 of 2021 is $7,000 in Q1 and $7,000 in Q2. That would be because you paid them a maximum of $10,000 of qualified wages in Q1, and again, a maximum of $10,000 of qualified wages in Q2. I apologize, that detail did not seem to make it into our final slide deck. But hopefully the information on the PPP was also helpful. And with that, we will turn it back to our friends at Prestige.
All right. You guys get me because I think Jason somehow got dropped off. So it's Andy again. First, again, I'd like to thank everybody for attending the WebEx. I hope you found it informative. Please keep a lookout for future WebExes. As I mentioned earlier, things are changing. Things are going to change. We're going to be on top of it. We want to make sure you're on top of it, so this way you can guide your company and course correct as necessary. Again, any questions that anybody has, please, if you haven't already sent them over via the WebEx to the chat room, let us know. Send it directly to your HRBP or anybody at Prestige, and we'll make sure that we compile those questions and get back to you with any answers. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day. All good things for 2021. Everybody stay well and safe. Malcolm and Seth, thank you very much. Jason, thank you very much for putting this all together. And everybody at Prestige, thank you for the effort. Have a good day.